Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first official guide of the new year, hosted by your big titty goth girlfriend, Makari, otherwise known as a Warframe video. Welcome, ladies and gents. Yes, that's right, it's our first guide of the new year, and what a way to start it off than with a Lavos guide. And also, if you're wondering why I suddenly look so dashing and sexy right now, then I would advise checking out my channel update video that I posted before this one. Kind of goes over what's going on, why I've been gone, and what's going on in my life and all that kind of jazz, and also the plans for the future of the channel. So do give that a gander if you want to have an understanding as to what's going on and why you're suddenly having a confusion about your sexuality. It's a new year, which means it's about time we make a new frame guide, starting with the latest frame to be added to Warframe and its ever-growing repertoire of death-inducing maniacs. Do you ever wonder if there'll be a point where there will be just too many Warframes in the game? Of course not! Not when we have a frame that literally embodies your inner desire to be Dexter Boy Genius, toiling away in his laboratory. And, much like Dexter, your objective with Lavos is to mix and match your abilities for sweet synergistic destruction, to stop those meddling Corpus DD bots from foiling your ingenious plans. But in all seriousness, Lavos is a frame that for the first time in quite some time actually feels like it's had something unique to bring to the table. What with having no energy pool and the ability to also swap between elements on the fly to empower and diversify his playstyle. Lavos is a frame that not only offers interesting playstyle dynamics, but a frame that also seems like a good midpoint between being easy to pick up for beginners, but not so brain dead that it makes you feel like you're playing Inaros. Sorry, Naros. But also not too overtly complicated to make it unapproachable for said beginner players. Come to think of it, really the only issue with getting this frame is actually getting him, as it requires you to do the Operation Orphix Venom event, which then requires it to actually be live in the first place, which, like a lot of events, will become active once or twice a year and remain active. In this case, it'll remain active for about a month or so, giving you plenty of time to farm for the frame when it's actually up. The event itself does encourage necromech usage, but keep in mind that this is not mandatory for you to actually have one of your own, as the mission itself does offer you lower tier default necromechs to use at the start of every mission. But you will find efficiency and in the form of crafting your own to make it far more efficient for yourself. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the event itself, as it's pretty straightforward. It's basically the Scarlet Spear all over again. If you guys want to see a video about this event, I might make one, but you'll have to let me know that down in the comments down below. Otherwise, we're going to focus purely on the frame itself for this video. The components and blueprint for building Lavos are purchasable from Father whilst the event is active, and they are then purchasable for the event's currency. Additionally, you can also get the blueprints as rotation drops from the event itself, although the drop chances are basically non-existent and incredibly abysmal. In fact, you'd probably have a higher chance in DE bringing the raids back at this point. I could talk about playstyle all day, as there's just so much diversity with being able to change between elements on the fly. But the only way you're going to know the ins and outs is if we look at the abilities themselves. But just remember, much like we saw with Zaku, Lavos is pretty new, so anything said in this guide is going to be subject to change. If anything does change dramatically, which, knowing how much DE love forcing me to remake my guides after reworking the frame the second I make a guide for them, is surely to happen, then I will remake that guide if it's needed. Starting with Lavos' passive, which is quite possibly one of the most extensive passives we've ever seen in the game, the first part of Lavos' passive is quite simple. Upon collecting an energy orb, Lavos will become status immune and cleanse himself of all status ailments for 10 seconds. This can then happen with a singular orb once every 5 seconds. Lavos does not have an energy pool, and his abilities require nothing to use. Instead, each ability, when used, will simply incur a cooldown, and instead of efficiency, reducing energy cost, it will instead affect the transmutation probe, which we'll talk about later, which is how you affect your cooldown reduction. Furthermore, duration is going to work a bit differently, and a little bit weirdly in fact for Lavos, increasing and decreasing status effects and cooldown durations depending on the setup and abilities you're using. So when you're building Lavos, you have to keep in mind that duration, efficiency are going to work a little bit differently. But in the summary of it, there are only really two main ways for building Lavos if you're going to play him for his generalized playstyles, which we'll talk about at the end of the video. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, this is where the meat of his passive. Lavos can swap between elements on the fly. Holding your 1 ability will change any of your abilities to toxin damage. Holding 2 will give you cold. Holding 3 will give electricity. And you guessed it, holding 4 will give heat. Upon deciding an element, you can then tap an ability key to imbue that ability with the chosen element type. This allows you to make great primers for comboing your elements with your abilities. So if you have an ability that starts with Toxin, you can combine Cold to create Viral. This then allows you adjustability as in your playstyle to meet the enemy resistances that you're fighting against. So now that we know the workings of one of the most extensive passives in all of Warframe, this will help understand Lavos' abilities and help them make a bit more sense. Now we're going to start with Lavos' one, which is Ophidian Bite. Lavos sends out his tentacles in a lashing fashion, dealing 1000 toxin damage and 1000 damage of your chosen imbued element, in a 100-degree cone spanning 8 meters in front of him. Enemies struck by these snaky tentacles heals Lavos for 15% of the total damage dealt, and will have a default 8-second cooldown after usage. And seeing as its default damage is toxin, you can then utilize your chosen element to produce things such as corrosive gas or viral damage. This is probably one of the abilities you're going to be spamming more diligently. And you really see what I mean when I say that there's a lot of versatility to this frame based on which elements you choose. Now, the range of this ability is affected by ability range. However, the angle of the cone is not. And then all damage and health conversion are affected by power strength. You'll be seeing this as kind of like your filler ability and something you just spam on the fly whenever it's off cooldown if you want to deal some instant, consistent damage. Lavos' 2 is called Vile Rush, a charge-like ability very similar to that of Hydroids that will send Lavos forward 30 meters. As he charges, he will send out 24 vials along the path, assuming he reaches the end of the path, that is. Each vial leaves behind a frozen pool for 8 seconds with a 2-meter radius. Enemies who decide they like to take a sip of the Kool-Aid will take 250 cold damage plus 250 damage of your imbued element type. When Lavos exits his charge, he will emit an icy explosion in a 9-meter radius, dealing cold damage to enemies caught in said radius. This ability comes initially with a 5-second cooldown, and then the explosive radius of the vials and ending explosion are all affected by ability range. To that end as well, your damage is then affected by your power strength. So you're going to want to see this ability more for its mobility, but when woven in with your other abilities and therefore your ultimate later down the line, you'll see some decent synergy and also utility for your team in the form of crowd control and also movement. However, also aiding you in priming enemies ready for your ultimate and also the synergy between your imbued elements. Lavos' 3 is Transmutation Probe. Now, this ability is where Lavos bases his focus around in order for consistent casting. In order to make the most use of all of your other abilities, you're going to want to make diligent and clever use of this ability. Enemies coming within 6 meters of this will receive 250 electric damage and 250 of the imbued damage you have equipped. And this is the important part. For each enemy struck, 1 second is removed from the active cooldowns of your abilities. To aid you in a more localized fight, you can also hold the ability key after launching the probe to hold it in the location it's at the time. This is to help if enemies are all clustered in one area or you need to defend a specific point. And this is the important part. You gain additional cooldown reduction when modding for efficiency. But with how much of a cooldown reduction you already gain, I'd say it's not really worth modding for efficiency unless you're going to be modding for a very high duration build, which sequentially will cause the cooldown of your abilities to be longer anyway. It kind of depends on your build whether you decide to go for efficiency, but this is how efficiency will affect your 3. To complement this further, you'll find most of your builds will focus around range to make sure you get as many enemies hit as possible by the cooldown reduction effect. Additionally, damage dealt by this is affected by ability strength, but unfortunately, the duration of the probe is not affected by anything. So see this as the smart man's ability. People who excel at Lavos are people who can diligently use your probe. See this as your tempo setter, as the bigger fights you get into, the more enemies you'll have to hit, and thus the bigger cooldown reductions you'll get, allowing you to spam your abilities more frequently. And as a final note, standard pickups on the ground that pass through the probe's field, including health orbs, energy orbs, and ammo packs, are transmuted into a special universal drop instead. Universal orbs provide 25 health and 25 energy points, while universal ammo packs replenish 10% of a weapon's ammo reserves for all weapons equipped. so just an extra bit of utility whenever you use your probe to reset your cooldowns. And finally, Catalyze is Lavos' 4, sending out 9 probes in all directions. These probes will travel 25 meters over 5 seconds, each probe jetting out an AoE cone of damage for 5 meters around them, dealing 2,000 heat damage and 2,000 of the imbued element for a total of 4,000 base damage. To excel this further, the damage is then doubled for every other element type on a target before being struck by this damage, meaning if you utilize your other abilities correctly and you chain some elements together on them, you can end up dealing huge damage with your ultimate. The distance and speed that the wiggly probes will travel are affected by ability range. The damage of everything here is then affected by ability strength. And essentially, if you want to make the most use of your abilities as a whole, you want to start a fight with your 1 and your 2 to spread elemental procs between all of your enemies, swapping between elements as you go to quote-unquote prime the enemies. Then use this ability to really ramp up the damage. And finally, to end your rotation of abilities, you'll use your 3 to reduce the cooldowns as diligently as possible, ready to set yourself up again for the rotation to start all over again. Finally, and very quickly, the builds. Now, the builds aren't exactly that complicated, as we've kind of come to the realization that the complication with Lavos is actually understanding how his abilities work. And in my eyes, there are 2 main ways you're going to play Lavos. One is utilizing this build, which focuses more on range. With more range, you're going to hit more enemies with your 3 to help you reset your cooldowns. Now, each ability isn't going to hit as hard, but realistically, any build you go for is going to be about balancing between range and power strength. With any build, it's always worth to have at least Streamline just to make sure you get as much of a cooldown reduction as possible. But here we have a range focus with Stretch, Overextended, and Cunning Drift. And Lavos is a pretty tanky boy from the word go, so helping that with at least 2 survival mods is always good. Any survival mods is up to you, so for me, I'm using Vitality and Adaptation. You can use any combination of things like Agile Agility, or Armored Agility, or Vitality, anything that works for you. As with all builds, it's about personal preference and finding what works for your playstyle. In this sense, I'm using Corrosive Projection just to help with the armor reduction, but you can use anything that kind of works for you. Obviously, Energy Siphon is obviously a no-go unless you fancy helping your team. And then we have Intensify and Blind Raged for the power strength. The other build, which focuses much more around self-contained damage and focusing much more on numbers as opposed to affecting large amounts of enemies, is this build. You focus on much more power strength, dropping Overextended for Transient Fortitude. You're still getting a little bit of range in there with Augur Reach and Stretch. You've got a little bit of continuity, and that's obviously going to affect the duration of your cooldowns, but making good use of your 3, you'll still be able to capitalize on that as diligently as possible. Again, 2 survivability mods, replacing Cunning Drift with Power Drift. This build focuses much more on self-play, focusing on having the ability to deal as much damage as possible, while still having some efficiency through your range. As far as beginner builds goes, it actually becomes kind of hard to make a beginner's build for Lavos, because we can't use Flow because there's no energy to make use of. So really, with any beginner's build for Lavos, you're going to just throw on whatever you can. The great thing about Lavos is, even with lackluster modding, he's incredibly powerful. All of his base abilities hit like a truck. So even if you just slap on the most nonchalant mods you've ever had in your life, you'll find that you'll still have a very powerful frame to work with. But with this beginner build, we're focusing on survivability. We've got Gladiator Aegis and Augur Reach, which you obtain from Plains of Eidolon bounties. And then we've got a balance between continuity, stretch, and intensify to help with the generalized stats. And then Steel Fiber and Vitality for the survivability. And obviously, it's kind of up to you how you want to mix and match. Just as long as you slap something on to help balance out his abilities and to push him forwards, you'll find Lavos never really does badly, regardless of how you build him. And that is a very shoddy Lavos guide. I do apologize if this video is a little bit less professional standard to what I would normally do. Obviously, it's been a couple of months now since I've made a video, so hey, it is what it is. But thank you so much for watching, guys. If you want to join my fellow Tenno here who joined me for the recording of this video, then there'll be a link to my Twitch and my Twitter down below. I always record these on stream to get you guys involved. Now, in terms of Lavos, I actually really like him. He's very unique. And I think it's just important to realize that the build is not necessarily the important part of Lavos. The important part is understanding the synergy between the abilities. And in my eyes, Lavos is just that one of the more unique frames we've had in a very long time. And if you have the opportunity to give him a try, please do so. It's a very refreshing take on a different semantic of frame that we've not seen before. So hopefully this video has been informative. Let me know down below what you think the next frame is going to be all about. And if you have any suggestions for guides and whatnot, do leave comments down in the comment section below as well. I always love hearing your opinions on things. Even the trolls. Oh, the trolls. Anyway, thank you for watching, guys. I'll see all of you top hatters in the next video where I will look just as sexy as now. I might even have hand trackers by that point so I can wiggle my fingers at you. Anyway, see you all in the next video. Ta-ra!